Alright, so I made a little quick demo just to demonstrate this map inventory system. This is the inventory in game here. Now, mind you, I did not make this level. This is the motion matching kind of animation demo. Alright, so let's go into the actual blueprints. So before I get started here with these two, just understand that I made an ABP core item, and then I made a child of that, which is the ABP master item. You might ask yourself, well, why did I do that? And it's just simply inheritance. And we're going to go ahead and, as we build our system out, we're going to want maybe equipment, we're going to want maybe money to get picked up, things like that. So you might need different classes for that. So anyways, all right, so on the ABP core item, I added these, just some basic information here, as well as I set up a kind of display mode enum that more or less is either realistic or arcade. And if it's realistic, it sets it sets collision, sets physics, and then it destroys the rotating component, which we've added here. The rotating component just, if we're running in the arcade mode, just kind of spins and kind of draws attention to an item that might be dropped. Alright, so on the ABP master item, I added just a little more on the variables here. And what we did is very similar to Jonathan's system here, which is just on component overlap, which is using this collision volume here. So if you scroll down here, these on component and end. So on component overlap, it's kind of checking to see if there's a component of this type for that resides within the actor or resides within the character, and then seeing if that component implements a interface, which it does. Then we just do some checks here, and auto pickup, which I've added to the actual item itself. And we're just going to use auto pickup just to keep this simple. I didn't have enough time to create the whole system here, so on auto pickup true, we more or less just get the class of self, and then we're going to add it to the inventory. Now this is slightly different from Jonathan's, as he uses the object reference instead of a class reference, which I honestly recommend using the class reference, because later on the system, when we're moving items around, we're going to need the class reference, not the object reference. So unless you want to build an entirely different function to add items to the inventory that uses the class, I recommend just doing this way. Though there's one thing I'll point out later on that you might reconsider. Alright, master. Alright, so that's that. So I've also created two more or less components. So I made the core inventory component, and then I've created a child of that, which is the player inventory component. Now you might ask yourself, why did I do that? And that's specifically for kind of modularity. So we're going to take this core inventory component and build most of the logic for like adding the inventory and things like that. Now later on down the line, if we need specific things for just the player inventory, we can build that inside this component instead of cluttering up the core component, which we might use later on for things like a chest or for a store, things like that. So real simply, I'll go over this. I think I'll go over this later. But more or less, I'm using kind of a function I made that I built in a library that gets us the HUD. And then let's go ahead and go through the actual meat of it right here. So we add something to the inventory. I set that to hell item, which is kind of a a part of the component here. So, and then our local quantity remaining is what we take the quantity from. And mind you, when I do the quantity, I just take it from the quantity right here. Now, the reason this works is because when we put something in the world, we can set that quantity. Like if I go here and click on this guy right here, I have this exposed and instance editable, so I can set that quantity, and then when you pick it up, it more or less sends that quantity over here. So here's the meat of this guy. So I'm just gonna kind of go through this. I don't want to waste too much time like talking about every single thing, but this is Ryan's logic more or less, and I'm just using this in a map variable. And by the way, the map variable is of ABP master item class, and then I have an enum here that has two integers in it, slot and quantity, and you'll understand why in a bit, why it's like that. So we go in here, we do our checks, as Ryan suggests, making two things to verify that we want to run this while loop, just to make sure that it's not just always running. So at first, we get an item, right? Set our quantity and all that fun stuff. Then we're gonna look for a slot. So, and forgive me, this is slightly messy just because I've been playing around and kind of learning. But here's the core of the logic right here. So we find a slot. How do we do that? Well, we check to see if that item exists inside the inventory. If it does, then we know we have found a slot, or we have found that item, and we know that it already exists. If it doesn't exist already, then we did not find a slot. How do we check to see if we have a slot or whatever, or if there's, I believe this is for checking to see if there's available room within a slot. So if it's greater, or if we take, what is this math here? Slot times max stack. So we times those together to make sure that it's not, or that we make sure that is greater than the actual quantity that we currently have. That means that there's extra room in one of the slots, basically. All right, so there's that. On and on. So we either add to stack, or we're going to create a new stack. So I've kind of done some, when I was setting this up, I had to do some print stuff just to make sure everything works. I built this kind of demo for someone, and they said they didn't want to deal with weight, but I had built in a system for weight as well if we want to play with that. Let me know if you guys want to see that. I can kind of go through that as well. So, okay, so let's just say we do find a slot, right, and it has room. We're going to go ahead and try to add to that stack. So we're going to go in here. It's the logic for add to stack. We're either checking to see if it does, if the inventory is visible or not, and if it is visible, or more or less doing an update inventory. Now, this isn't my favorite way of doing this. I'd rather just update the slot, but because of how things work inside of Unreal in this system, it's slightly sloppily done in the fact that it's kind of always clearing that all inventory slots, and that kind of breaks this reference. So we can't really use this logic of more or less trying to find that specific slot and just updating that. So I kind of did a workaround here that allows us to more or less have a functioning system. This is like when the inventory is open and we want to make sure that it's continually updating. If it's not, we just more or less add the quantity to the quantity of that actual inventory And notice the add here is actually add or remove. We'll talk about that a little bit later, but more or less I'm just adding one because of how the system works. We're only adding one at a time. All right, and then what I'm doing is I'm subtracting one from the quantity remaining. And then we would just repeat that process, boom, 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 until the quantity remaining is 0, more or less. Now, when we find a slot, or when we get to find slot and we can't find a slot, we're going to go down to this logic. We're going to check the inventory. Here's the logic for that. We're more or less trying to see if the values within this inventory system, we're going to check the slots plus local slots used, which we're setting over here. Forgive me, I forget a little bit of this logic just because it's been a minute. And I'm not sure exactly if we need to reset this, because every time it runs, I'm assuming it probably starts with the local slot used being 0, but just in case. We're more or less checking to see if there is available room within the inventory itself, because we have a max inventory size, which we set over here, of 20, and we're more or less trying to figure out, because of how a map works, it's creating unique instances or references or whatever you want to call it of each item type. So whenever I want to have multiple slots of one item, I'm going to have to more or less kind of mimic a multi-slot inventory instead of actually using like an array, which is a different system. But there's your check. All right. Forgive me, I'll ramble off sometimes. Let's just go through create new stack here. So this is more or less how we add and make a new stack. So we're more or less taking the value of the quantity to add, which we're assuming, because of how this how this whole system works, is we can't make I could if I wanted to, but this quantity should not exceed the max stack value, unless you want to mess something up. So there we are. So basically what we're doing is every time we're taking the quantity, we're adding it to the current quantity of that same item, and then we're increasing the slot by 1. So we're using a break and a make. And because of how add works, we can either add or subtract. And we have this more or less set up so that if this doesn't exist, then we're just going to make a new one, and we're going to add it as one slot, and we're going to take that quantity. Same thing, more or less. All right. So there we go, creates. So because we're taking the entire remaining, or the quantity remaining, we're going to make that 0 now. And then we're going to go ahead and do a little check here, which is if the inventory is open or not. And if it is open, then we're going to run this update inventory. And that's about it for that. All right, so on to the components. This is the player inventory. So I've more or less just kind of plugged in. This is the slight, because we're having to use a child, or what I recommend doing is using a child. We can kind of modify existing functions by going in here and like kind of selecting it. When we do that, it'll just give us this parent add to inventory, because I'm on add to inventory, obviously. So I just make sure that this sets that item correctly. I was actually going to do some more magic here and make sure that item to pick up basically sets the held inventory, but I kind of didn't get around to it. One thing to note is you need to make sure that you have a return node whenever you do one of these. If you don't have this return node, it's going to not work. Okay. Now, on to the widgets. So, inventory slot, more or less, we have current stack, which is exposed and editable. We have held item, index, which we would use to more or less catalog every item that's inside of that, inside of the all inventory slots, and slot image and slot stack, which are basically parts of the design. Okay, so update slots, pretty straightforward. We just set the held item, and then we get that class default. You get the icon. We set the actual slots icon, and then we're going to select the actual current stack right there. So that's the straightforward basic for that. All right, so forgive me, I cut some corners on this next part just because didn't have enough time, but this is just a one-size-fits-all answer for this. I'm going to make another video right after this one that'll show you more of a custom kind of fit for doing an update inventory function. This update inventory function, and notice I have some of the logic kind of built that we're not really using, like removing an item, which I'll demonstrate again in the next video. Okay, so when we do these update inventories, like over here, right here, this guy, we're more or less doing this. So where if it's open already, we're just going to clear everything and then rebuild everything. So on widget creation, this is the logic. Pretty sure you guys can read, so I don't really want to go through every single part of this, but more or less taking the values. You can either, when you grab a map variable, you can either grab the keys or the values, and I'm grabbing the values just because I need it right here for this loop, but then I also need the keys. So what I'm doing is I'm grabbing the keys here. I'm using the array index to reference what specific item I want out of that that key array, and then we're doing a get, which we'll get to later here. It's more or less plugging into these update slots. So first of all, we're doing this little guy right here, which is just a check to make sure we're doing what we want to do and making sure that the slots are not empty, or the slots are basically not zero. And then we're setting our local quantity, and then we're doing a for each loop. So within the for each loop, there is a for loop, my bad, that basically takes the number of slots, and then we're going over here. We're doing kind of a check every single time we do this to make sure that we have a full stack. If we don't have a full stack, or if we don't have if the quantity remaining is less than the max stack, then we just add the remaining quantity into the current stack when we make a slot. So this guy right here. And this is pretty straightforward. So we're just doing the create. We're adding a reference, like we're taking the object reference here, and we're adding it to an array of all inventory slots. Then we're setting the index of the actual slot. So that would be this right here, boop, 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 right here. So we're setting this right here, over here. And then we're updating that slot, running that update function that I just showed you. And I'm a big fan of being lazy and not doing extra shit. So, oh no, I cussed. There's profanity in this now. Extras work. So instead of doing like a grid box or like a grid container and having to assign each grid thing, I just like to use a wrap box, and I just throw things in and it just kind of puts them in order. All right, so, and that's if we don't have, if our quantity remaining is less than the max stack, then we do this. Now, if the quantity remaining is greater than the max stack, more or less we just subtract max stack from quantity remaining and add a new slot, and more or less with like a full stack. You know, we're taking max stack and we're making it the value of the current stack. And then again, we're doing the same process of adding it to an array. We set the index, we update the slot, and then we add it to the container. All right, so that is the widget. Next, yeah, just so you guys understand, this is the enum. So we got slots and quantity. There you go, pretty straightforward. Last part is really we're going to go over the HUD and the player controller. This is Kiku gave me this idea, or more or less this kind of structure. He recommends that you, and here's something to note, whenever you make a widget, that you set the widget's default visibility to collapsed. So this comes into play right here. So we're doing this little set input so we don't have to click into the window, and then we're creating the HUD, adding it to viewport, and then we're creating the game menu. Now notice there's a little bit of a loop here, and you're like, why is it a loop for one thing? Well, this is modular, so when we build more things, we can add more things. But notice we're adding it immediately on begin play. But because it's collapsed, and this is something Kiku did the research for, it doesn't take up any extra performance. It doesn't hinder anything. It just kind of loads it as it's beginning, as the game is beginning, and then we'll use a toggle inventory to more or less set the visibility. So this is that. So if it's collapsed, then we set it to visible. If it's visible, then, or my bad, we don't set it to visible. We set it to not hit testable. And I have some little focus widget, focus game logic here. This is another thing that Kiku recommended doing. I'm not really using this because I'm already setting it, but there's that and there's that. All right. So that's the toggle widget. And this toggle widget is being called inside the player controller. And I'll take this opportunity to go through this. So this is Kiku again, and his kind of a repeatable function, like a function that repeats like 10 times, like this one. Every second it's going to check and try to get the HUD. As he explains it, more or less, we're concerned with when we try to grab this, if things aren't loaded, there's like a procedure to it, and if you can't find it the first time, it might just fail, and you don't want to create like a really sloppy loop that just keeps doing it. So this is his kind of loop that will check 10 times, and if it fails, then it just outputs a failed. And this is a blueprint macro library, by the way. So you make one specifically for different blueprints. So I built one for the player controller, and I built one for the component, which you'll see I have used right here. So they are like the same function, but you'll notice that you won't be able to find it if you don't make it specifically for where you're using it. All right, so anyways, back to this. So on begin play, we just get that and we set the HUD. That's what we're doing as well inside of the component. This right here I was starting to do like a pickup functionality, but I didn't really get around to it. Last part really is here. So we're using just, I really wish I could have done the enhanced inputs just to demonstrate that part, which I recommend using versus just like hard coding in to a specific input, but time is of the essence, so we're doing it this way, checking the visibility, and then we're updating it So obviously we don't need to update if it's not visible. And yeah, that's pretty much it. If you have questions or comments or whatever, let me know. Like and subscribe, I guess, or whatever. Yeah, thanks for watching. Oh yeah, here we go, debug. And this is a fun little debug thing. This is, when you're first getting started and you don't have the widgets set up, this is kind of useful to, you know, see if information's actually getting inside of the map variable. Okay, yeah, that's it. I'm done. Hope you guys enjoyed.